Amen. Well, I appreciate the prayers for our house to sell. Yes, our house in Bloomington, Indiana is on the market now. So if people would pray for that, that would be wonderful. And also, what I prayed about, being bold and witnessing, I do think it was important tonight that in two separate prophecies, God specifically said that you are the lights of the world. And I think this is really a time for Christians not to fly below the radar, that kind of thing. And I know that right now there's this kind of social feeling about the worst thing in the world you can do is offend somebody. Well, if you think about it, that's exactly the tactic the devil would want to take, because Jesus Christ is called the stumbling stone, and people are going to stumble over him. And that was one of the first prophecies when Simeon and Anna were prophesying over the baby Jesus. That was one of the first prophecies that, a sword or a spear will go through your soul, and that's really true, that Christ is a stumbling stone, and you and I can't make him not a stumbling stone. You can't say anything about him that's so nice and so inoffensive that somebody won't get offended. He is the stumbling stone. So we just have to make peace with the fact that if somebody's upset with us for mentioning Jesus Christ, oh, well, I mean, any of us could get offended at any number of things that the people of the world mention, but they aren't embarrassed to mention what they're committed to. I'm amazed at the number of, I'm down here in Florida. I don't know the radio station, so I tapped into this country western station. I was driving around, listened to it, and I was like, is every song about getting drunk? It's like there's so many songs out there about people getting drunk. It's like, oh, wait, I mean, that should be offensive to Christians. Ephesians says, don't be drunk. Somebody singing about the pleasures of getting drunk, that should be offensive. But that shows you the boldness that the pagan world has. The unbelieving world is so bold. My gosh, guys, we've got everlasting life that we can offer people. So we really ought to be bold and completely unashamed to say, yes, I'm a Christian. Yes, I believe in Jesus Christ. Absolutely. It's wonderful, wonderful stuff. And so anyway, I wanted to say that, by the way, and the spiritual things, I mean, I would say they're heating up. I'm assuming that most of you know that down here in Florida, there's a statue of Jesus Christ out in front of a Roman Catholic church that was a bunch of rioters knocked it over, decapitated Jesus, and ran off with his head, and they still haven't found it. And in another area in the country, the statue of Mary in front of a church was spray painted. So if anybody thinks that Christians are not under attack, you need to kind of open your eyes, because even here in the United States, I know we prayed for our brothers and sisters in other countries that are being persecuted, but I guarantee you it's coming our way. It's just a matter of, us we got to be prepared for it. But mentally, we also need to know that we're the lights of the world. We're the ones that are giving them the choice. They're not backing us into a corner. We're giving them the choice. I mean, God created the heavens and the earth, and there's that prophecy in one of the prophets that God holds the universe, in the span of his hand, and the span is between the tip of your thumb. So here's God. He created the universe, and he holds it in the span of his hand. You're not going to throw a rock at him. You're not going to offend him. He's asking us to be bold, and that's what our job is. So I want to continue where I left off, more or less, when on Sunday, and I taught about Jonah, and I gave some of the background of Jonah, and I want to go into the book of Jonah tonight. And so we'll start right in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1, because there's so many great lessons in Jonah, and particularly if you understand the background and you understand the culture. And so in Jonah chapter 1, we start right away in verse 1. Now the word of Yahweh, now the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, now we don't know exactly how, whether God appeared to Jonah in a vision, whether God spoke audibly to him, where God impressed the truth on his mind through the gift of spirit that God put on Jonah. but there is Yahweh God, and he does speak to people. And this is a great example of it. And we can look for that in our life. If there's a lesson right in Jonah chapter 1, verse 1, it's that God speaks to people. And then given that we're his birth children, we've been born again, and that our salvation is guaranteed and his love is guaranteed, we can bet he's going to speak to us. So we just need to have our ears open. And I love what that God says here in, in verse 2. He says, get up. And now, if we follow get up through the book of Jonah, it occurs a number of times. It's God telling Jonah to get up. Then the shipmaster tells Jonah to get up. Then God tells Jonah to get up again. And then the king of Assyria gets up off his throne. So the phrase get up is a pivotal one in the book of Jonah. And again, if we have our little notebook, we read our Bible, we have our notebook, this is one of those nifty mini lessons, about just get up. The time for sitting around is done. The time for sitting back is over with. The time for sitting and watching is gone and done. The time now is just like the time of Jonah. Things are desperate. At the time of Jonah, things were desperate. Now things are desperate. In God's word, get up. If you're feeling like you're doing enough, not doing enough, get up. And so he says, get up. And then he surprises Jonah, because as we learned from the last teaching, Jonah was a very powerful prophet in Israel. But God's going to do something here that caught Jonah completely off guard. He says, go to Nineveh, that great city. And Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria. And Assyria was the big dog at the time of Jonah. Assyria had apparently, at the time Jonah was writing, Assyria had already come around the Fertile Crescent from the east, around the Fertile Crescent, down to the southwest, and attacked and destroyed Syria. So Assyria, the bigger country, came and attacked Syria, which was the country to the immediate north of Israel, and wiped it out. And now Assyria was positioning itself to attack and destroy Israel, but they were having some internal problems. There was some kingshifts going on and some internal problems that were weakening Assyria's military thrust, if you will, their military advancement. And that becomes very important, because that gave Israel and Judah, at the time of Jonah, a chance to breathe. And people were aware of this. And then here comes the word of the Lord to Jonah, arise, go to Nineveh. Let me bring up the map. I'm going to share my screen just a little bit, just so we make sure we get this. So you should have now up on your screen the map of the Assyrian Empire. And you see little Israel down here. Here's Jerusalem. And the port of Joppa is about right here, just literally kind of across from the dot of Jerusalem. And here's Nineveh, way over here, this guy. And Nineveh is a 600-mile hoof. If you go around the Fertile Crescent, you go up up to the Sea of Galilee, go up the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, follow the Orontes River Valley, hop onto the Tigris-Euphrates River system, and then make it over to Nineveh. And you got a 600-mile hoof. And Jonah, when God told him to go to Nineveh, he would have remembered the prophecy of Ahijah, which was basically 200 years before that. And Ahijah said that Israel, because of its disobedience, would be scattered beyond the Euphrates. And so now all of a sudden, Israel is really in bad shape. They're misbehaving. They're being very disobedient. And Jonah gets a revelation to go to Nineveh and preach against it. And Jonah could see what was coming. And so he didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he figured the Assyrians would come and attack Israel and destroy them, which in fact they did. So Jonah, instead, let's go back to, I'm going to stop sharing. There it is. There's my little stop share button. So So God says, go to Nineveh and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Of course, that was a big key to Jonah too, because pagan countries were wicked in general. I mean, but in this case, God said, no, they're especially wicked, so I want you to go and preach to them. Verse 3, but Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. Now, there's some debate over where Tarshish is, but we're pretty sure it's southern Spain. So if you think about the Mediterranean Sea, when Jonah gets on the boat at Joppa, you know, he's got to sail past what we call Turkey. They called it, you know, in the Roman Empire, it was called Asia. But you sail past Turkey, then you sail past Greece, then you sail past Rome, then you sail past the French Riviera and all that. And then finally you get to southern Spain. I mean, it's a long way. And what is Jonah doing? Well, Jonah lived at a time when people generally believed that the gods went with a certain territory. And so that's why it says, verse 3, Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. Jonah figured, well, if I can get away from Israel and get away from Yahweh, then I won't be asked to do this mission that I don't want to do. And it's kind of interesting, back to James' prophecy tonight when he said, you know, it's not hard to do the word of the Lord. It wouldn't be, now, it's challenging to walk, 600 miles and go to the capital city of an enemy nation. It's challenging to do it mentally, but it's not hard to do it. You just put your sandals on and start walking. And so it's very interesting when James's prophecy said it's not hard to do the word of the Lord. You know, it's not hard to outwardly show that you're a Christian. It can be challenging if you get yelled at or laughed at or, you know, challenged or whatever. It can be challenging, but it's not hard to do. You know, and that's what God wants us to do. We just do the very next best thing, and that's where the get up. You know, here's this lesson in Jonah. Get up. It's not hard to do. And Jonah is going to flee from Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. By the way, if you understand that it was common in the culture to believe that the gods went with a certain territory, if you understand that, then a lot of the different verses through the Old Testament, as you read the Old Testament, they will come alive. For example, I'm thinking about 2 Kings chapter 20, when the Israelites were fighting the Syrians. And if you go to 1 Kings chapter 20, verse 23, the Israelites who had a little bitty army beat the Syrians, who had a big, huge army. And the Syrians were confused. Wow, how did they pull that off? And so in 1 Kings 20, verse 23, it says, the servants of the king of Syria said to him, well, their God is a God of the hills. Therefore, they were stronger than we. In other words, we made a mistake. We went into the hill country. That's where their God lives. So they beat us. Well, let's lure them out. See, let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we will be stronger than they. So they said, if we can get them away from where their God lives, then we're going to win. In 2 Kings chapter 5, as I look at the faces here on the screen, I know many of you are familiar with the story of the Naaman, the Syrian, the leper, and he was healed by Elisha. And after he was healed, he wanted to give a present to Elisha. Elisha turned him down. In verse 16 of 2 Kings chapter 5. So what does he in verse 15, he says, please take a gift. Verse 16, as Yahweh lives before whom I stand, said Elijah, I'm not going to take one. And Naaman urged him to take it, but he refused. Verse 17, so Naaman said, if not, then please let 2 mules' burdens of earth, of dirt, be given to your servant. For from now on, your servant will offer neither burnt offering nor sacrifice to other gods, but only to Yahweh. Now, what's Naaman doing? He says, well, I want to sacrifice to Yahweh. Well, gosh, I can't really do that in Syria. Yahweh is the God of Israel. Oh, I know what I'm going to do. If I take 2 donkey loads of dirt, and I'll create this kind of dirt sandbox with the dirt from Israel, and then I'll be able to worship Yahweh, because Yahweh lives on this dirt. And that's what they were thinking. So there's various kinds of things like this that put the word together, and that's what Jonah's doing. Jonah's like, well, everybody knows Yahweh lives, he lives in the temple in Jerusalem, dwelling between the cherubim, and if I get out of here, then I'm out his territory. He won't find me or whatever. Verse 4, but Yahweh hurled a great wind upon the sea. And the Hebrew word hurled is hurled or threw. It's the same word used in the text when it's talking about throwing a spear. And basically it's just, it's showing God's tremendous intervention. See, God had a plan. He had something he wanted done. Plus he had people in Assyria that he knew would believe him. And he wanted to bless them. God is a God who will bless pagans if they will believe. Well, that's what he does. I mean, when non-Christians come to Christ, that's what he does. He opens their heart. They come to Christ, and so here Yahweh's like, I'm sorry, Jonah, I've got a job that I really need you to do. So he throws this great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty storm on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Verse 5, then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God. And they knew the weather patterns on the Mediterranean Sea are very predictable. And the fact that this great storm came up, they knew there was a reason for it. Okay, something really strange is going on, and every man is crying out to his God. Why? Well, the mariners were probably from different places, and so they had different gods, and each man is crying out to his God because they don't know what the cause of the trouble is at that point. And they threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. And that's an interesting, there's the scholars debate, but I think it's pretty clear that a lot of people say, or some of the scholars say, I should say it's better, some of the scholars say that they threw the cargo in the ship to lighten the ship, but it's actually to lighten them. It's to lighten the burden that they were feeling that the ship was about to break up. They lightened the ship for themselves, because they wanted to save the ship and they wanted to save their own lives. So they threw the cargo in. Verse 5, then the mariners were afraid, and every man, I just read that. Okay, lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the innermost part of the ship, and he was laying down and was fast asleep. Jonah's just got that inner peace that just allows him to fall asleep in the storm, and he's just fast asleep down in the ship. Verse 6, so the captain came to him and said, what do you mean, you sleeper? Get up. Well, here we go again. See, verse 2, God says, get up. And Jonah didn't, or actually Jonah did. I didn't point this out, but in verse 3, it says Jonah got up, but he got up to flee instead of get up to obey. And now here comes the captain of the ship, and he's a pagan. He's an unbeliever, he's not an Israelite. And he says, what do you mean, you sleeper? Get up. Like I say, this plays a part here in the book of Jonah. And then he says, call on your God, which is powerful. I mean, here is a captain. We don't know what his relationship, what gods he worshiped. We don't even know where he came from, whether he came from, say, Anatolia and had that set of gods, or whether he came from Greece and had a different set of gods, or further west and had a different set of gods. We don't know, but he did believe in the power of prayer. And that's a powerful thing, that here's somebody who doesn't believe in Yahweh God, but he understands the power of prayer. And so he goes to Jonah and he says, what do you mean, you sleeper? Get up and pray. Pray to your God. We don't know where this thing came from. We don't know what God did this. We don't know who we've offended. So you get up and you pray to your God. And that's pretty amazing when you've got to have an unbelieving sea captain telling a seasoned prophet to pray. And it just goes to show, sometimes really good advice can come from unexpected quarters. That's one of those nifty little mini lessons about, God can work in the surroundings to bring advice from unexpected places. And that's exactly what's going on here. The captain says, call on your God. Maybe your God will take note of us so that we do not perish. He didn't know it's, let's not let a stone go unturned. And then the sailors are talking, and I like this in verse 7, it says, and they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, so that we may know who's responsible for this evil that is upon us. And the fact that they talk to one another, it's not that the captain called a meeting and they had some big meeting and the captain ran the meeting and this and that and the other thing. You've got a bunch of sailors there. They come from different places. They had different gods, and sailors were usually generally pretty superstitious people. And so somebody said, I can just kind of get the crew on the ship in my mind. And, somebody said, we know this is not natural. This has to be somebody's offended a god. That's the way they would think, so let's cast lots and find out who. And somebody else picks something, that's a great idea. We should cast lots. And somebody else overhears that. And it's like, that would be, that's the way we really ought to move forward here. And so verse 7, they said to one another, come, let us cast lots. And that's another really interesting mini lesson, is that sometimes the proper direction, sometimes the right way to go, sometimes the godly idea doesn't come from the leader or from a meeting, but just comes kind of from the general populace as people are going through the same thing. They're experiencing the same thing, and people are using their minds and they're trying to work stuff out. And somebody says, we should do this. And somebody else, that's a good idea. And the next thing you know, they've come together and decided on it. And that's exactly what happened here. There wasn't any meeting or whatever. It was just a logical step to take. And it came up as a result of people just thinking and being free on their own. So they said, come, let us cast lots, so we may know who's responsible for this evil that is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And the Bible doesn't describe to us or explain to us what method of lots was used. And there were a number of different methods of casting lots in the ancient world. In this particular situation, God isn't concerned enough about it to let us know anything about what particular method of casting lots they used. What's really important is the, sorry about that. Had a little thing across my screen. But what was really important was the lot fell on Jonah. Verse 8, and they said to him, tell us now, on whose account this evil is upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? Of what people are you? Verse 9, and he said to them, well, I really don't want to talk about it because I might offend somebody. No, I want you to see the boldness here of a real prophet. I am a Hebrew, and I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Now, maybe nobody else on the boat believed that. Maybe nobody else on the boat had even ever heard that about Yahweh. But I love the boldness there. That Jonah basically, here's the situation, guys. I'm a Hebrew, and my fear, my reverence, my awe is of Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land, who, by the way, I'm happily disobeying right now. Jonah, verse 10. And then were the men exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? Wait a minute, you fear Yahweh and now you're running away from him, and you've made him mad, and look, and we're the ones that are suffering here. What's going on? It says, for the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of Yahweh because he told them. And that lets us know that this, we can read the book of Jonah in a few minutes. It's only 4 chapters. But these conversations would have taken quite some time. There was a lot of information passed back and forth. And then verse 11, then they said to him, what should we do to you so that the sea will become calm for us? For the sea was getting rougher and rougher. And that's pretty standard. When somebody would sin, what do we do? Is there a sin offering, a trespass offering? Do we have to, what do we have to do? Because, you've offended God. And verse 12, so he said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will be calm for you, for I know that it is because of me that this great storm is upon you. And that seems really unreasonable, because people disobey God all the time. And like we know that, you sin against God, you offer a sin offering. There's sin offerings and trespass offerings and peace offerings and wave offerings and heave offerings and burnt offerings. There's all kinds of offerings in the Mosaic law for people that had offended God or had become separated from God in various ways. And there's none that said, but if you do this, go kill yourself. Just, and that didn't make any sense in the context. And yet I think Jonah understood that really that was, what needed to happen in this situation. So he kind of, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of background as to how he knew this, but somehow he did. So he said, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and the sea will be calm. Verse 13, and this is, verse 13 is really kind of powerful on two levels. Number one, on just a human level, that these men would see the value of human life and just say, all of their experience as seamen who traveled in different ports and stuff, they would just say, no, this isn't making any sense. You sin against God and we end up killing you. No, that doesn't make any sense. So on a human level, these men did what they thought was right. And also, they were also on what they understood about the gods was that if you harmed someone, even if you did so righteously, in general, in the pagan religions, the gods are capricious enough, unreliable enough that they can then decide that they're mad at you for it. A great example of that in the Old Testament is Yahweh talking about Babylon, that Judah is sinning, and God's going to send Babylon to punish Judah. It's really that's the verbiage in the Old Testament. What actually happened is Judah was sinning, and so God couldn't protect them from the devil who inspired the Babylonians. But then God says, and then I will punish the Babylonians for the cruelty that they execute on you. And so these sailors are used to the fact that, okay, just because you do something you think is right to appease a God doesn't mean that, 5 minutes later, he's not going to be mad at you for it. So the sailors on two levels, of kind of a natural human one and on a spiritual one, said, no, we're not going to throw you into the sea. So verse 13, nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. And by the way, when it says the men rowed hard to get the ship to land, it's probably that the ship was always in sight of land, even with the storm. Because in those ancient days, and particularly if it was going to get cloudy, if you got outside of the sight of land, you had no way. They didn't really have any kind of reliable compass. They certainly didn't have a sextant or anything like that where they could tell what direction they were going. So if you got out of sight of land, you could get turned around in a heartbeat and then sail right back where you came from, or sail off into the deep blue sea, never to be seen from again. And so it was a very, very standard tactic that if you had a small ship, you sailed out far enough that you weren't in danger of rocks, but you sailed inside of land. So they would sail up the coast, around the coast of Turkey, zoom across over to Greece, be inside of Greece, and then the same thing for Rome, and then on back to Spain. So that's why they would say, okay, there's the land over there, and they would start rowing. We can probably make it. We can probably don't have to throw this guy into the ocean. We can probably get him back to land, and he can deal with his God then. So verse 13, nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. And then verse 14, then they cried out to Yahweh because they knew Jonah's God was Yahweh. Jonah said, look, this is Yahweh's doing. I'm running from him. And so he's mad. And so they're crying out to Yahweh, please Yahweh, do not let us die for this man's life, and do not hold against us innocent blood. See, they're saying that so that Yahweh won't get mad at them after they throw Jonah over. So don't let us die for this man's life, and don't hold against us innocent blood. For you, Yahweh, have done as it pleased you. Verse 15, so they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. And so it's interesting, this is a second use of the word hurled there. God hurled the storm, and so to deal with the storm, they hurled Jonah. So they hurled him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. And it happened quickly enough and abruptly enough that all those sailors were able to connect the fact that that guy going overboard, then the sea became calm. Wow. And so verse 16, then the men feared Yahweh with a great fear. And this is, if you watch how I've translated this verse, it's very, very powerful in the Hebrew because there are three couplets. The men feared Yahweh with a great fear. They sacrificed a sacrifice, and they vowed vows. So you have this punchy sentence with three couplets. So it really grabs your attention, and it shows you, here are these guys, and again, we don't know what country they came from, and they certainly didn't worship Yahweh. And yet, boy, in this case, now they're like, wow, this Yahweh guy, he's like really powerful. So they feared Yahweh with a great fear. And this is not awe fear, although I'm sure there was a little awe mixed in there, but they were afraid of him. I mean, their ship could have been broken apart. They could have all drowned because of the anger of Godway. So the anger of Yahweh. So they're like, wow, he's like electricity. You just don't want to mess around with him. So the men feared Yahweh with great fear, and they sacrificed a sacrifice to Yahweh. And of course, there's no priests, there's no Levites, but Yahweh gets their heart. They wanted to appease him. They recognized him as a God with great power. So they sacrificed to Yahweh, and they vowed vows. Now, what would they vow vows about? Well, they probably would vow vows about the fact that when we do get safely to land, we're going to find out more about you, and we're going to offer a proper sacrifice to you. Because, in the context of this, they're vowing vows in the context of Yahweh causing a storm and then Yahweh stopping a storm. And they're sailors. They're like, okay, if this is the kind of power this Yahweh God has, we better find something out about him. So they're going to vow vows. And I think that's, there's a great mini lesson there. You can already see there's a lot of mini lessons in Jonah, but here's a great mini lesson that because of what happened due to Jonah's witness, you've got people that are all of a sudden interested in finding out about Yahweh. And see, that type of thing has not gone away. As you and I plug into the power of God, plug into the power of prayer, talk about Jesus Christ, talk about Yahweh, people will pay attention. That was in a prophecy tonight too. Some people won't pay attention, but some people will pay attention. And those people that pay attention, they're precious. They're priceless. We have to try to reach those kind of people, turn them from darkness to light, bring them into the family. And we have no idea. I mean, the book of Jonah and the Bible, it isn't about the lives of these sailors after Jonah leaves their presence. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know if we're going to see any of them in the resurrection of the just. That some of them may have landed and said, hey, is there a Jew around here? I really want to find out about this Yahweh guy. We just don't know. But Jonah's life here obviously had a tremendous impact in pointing them toward the power and presence of Yahweh. Like I say, and that could end up as meaning eternal life for these guys. I mean, that's an amazing truth. And then here's Yahweh, of course. Now he's got to deal with Jonah, who's now in the sea. And it says, verse 17, now Yahweh prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. Now Yahweh is going to prepare a number of things in the book of Jonah. And I think here we're paying attention to what has God prepared for us. Sometimes I use the phrase, and I forget who I learned this from, but it was years ago, but tee it up. That if you're going to meet with somebody that you haven't met with before, and you've got business to conduct, but you're wondering if something more can come from it. Can this become a Christian witness? Can this help somebody turn from darkness to light? Then we pray to God, God, can you prepare the situation? Can you tee it up for your glory? And that's basically what's happening here. God, he knows he's going to do this storm thing. He prepares a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And as I explained on Sunday morning, we don't know whether this was a fish or a whale. Both in the Hebrew language and in the Greek language, they didn't make the taxonomical, biological, zoological distinctions that we make, where we say, well, they're seagoing mammals and they're dolphins or whales, or maybe a manatee or something like that. And then there's seagoing fish, and they breathe in a different way. In the ancient languages, the distinction they made was it was either small and it was one word, or it was big and it was a different word. And so what we know about this thing was it was big. It could be a big fish, could be a big whale, but God prepared it, and it was right where God needed it to be when Jonah was thrown into the water. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And as I taught on Sunday morning, that becomes very important. Jonah was dead. He was not alive inside the fish. I know that a lot of people believe he was alive, and that's because of the next verse we're going to read. But Jonah was dead, and he was a type of Christ. And that's why Christ said, as Jonah was, so shall the Son of Man be. And Jonah was dead for 3 days and 3 nights, and Jesus Christ was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. So that's Jonah chapter 1. Let's jump to Jonah chapter 2. And in Jonah chapter 2, it says, and Jonah prayed to Yahweh his God out of his fish's belly. And this is the verse that then gets people to believe that Jonah was alive inside the fish. But we know from even seafaring tales back when the whaling industry was very large in the 1800s, there are documented cases where sailors fell overboard when they were harpooning a whale and were eaten by the whale, swallowed by the whale. And then when the whale, of course, was pulled onto the boat, which the other sailors did very quickly, and then cut the whale open, that the sailor was able to be revived and was still alive. And so Jonah, he's going to pray out of the fish's belly. He may only be conscious for a minute or two, but it's phenomenal to me that during that time period he prayed. A lot of times it takes having something happen in your life that kind of shakes you and wakes you to get you from being stubborn. I mean, here's Jonah, and he's being disobedient, and he's running from God, and he's a seasoned prophet, and he knows the word of the Lord, and he's running from it. But when he's thrown into the sea and he realizes, there's really no help here except God. I mean, I'm out here in the middle of a storm, in the middle of an ocean. I am going to drown. I'm not going to be able to swim back to shore any more than those sailors could row back to shore. Even if the storm quit, I couldn't swim all that way. But so Jonah realizes my only help is God. And at that point, he something really changed and shifted inside of him, or it may have even shifted earlier when he said, throw me into the sea. And so when all of a sudden he's, it's like, oh my gosh, here comes this big lump. There it was. And he's inside this fish's belly, and he does the same thing you or I would do. He has a quick prayer before he loses consciousness. And verse 2, he said, and then what he said here, as we read these verses, you'll be able to recognize that that he's saying this after he was out of the fish's belly. It vomited him up onto the dry land. God raised him from the dead. And this stuff that we're going to read now is stuff that he would have known after the fish vomited him up. He didn't know this in the fish's belly. So he starts out, he says, out of the midst of my distress, I called to Yahweh and he answered me. Now, how would he know that? He'd know that Yahweh answered me because he's alive on the Phoenician coast. Out of the belly of Sheol, I cried out. In other words, I was about to die out of the belly of the state of death. That's what Sheol is. It's the state of being dead. I was right there in the belly of death, and I cried out, and God heard my voice. And how would Jonah know that? Because God raised him from the dead. Verse 3, for you threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas. The flood was all around me. All your breakers and your waves passed over me. That's Jonah as he's remembering being in the sea. Verse 4, so I said, I've been banished from your sight. And he fully expected to die. And I think that's interesting that he knew he was disobedient. He knew he was running from Yahweh. He knew he had gotten himself into a pickle. What happened with Jonah being eaten by a fish and taken to the shore and raised from the dead, it never happened before. There was no reason for Jonah to expect that God would do anything like that. So what does he say? He says, I've been banished from your sight, meaning what? I'm going to die. And what happens when you die? You're dead. You have no life in you. And so he understands, I've been banished from your sight. That's going to be the end of me. But watch what he says here. This is so powerful. So he said, I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. And we need to properly understand that, because some commentators teach that, well, Jonah must have known this fish was going to spit him up on the shore and he was going to be able to see the temple in Jerusalem again. Actually, we don't know whether that ever happened. Jonah got spit up on the shore. He walked the 400 miles to Nineveh. He waited around to see that Nineveh wasn't going to be destroyed, even though his prophecy said it was. And then the book of Jonah ends. We don't know whether the Assyrians turned on Jonah. We don't know anything else about his life. But what I think what we're really seeing here is such a hope that Jonah knew he was a prophet. He knew he loved God. He knew he loved Israel. He knew he was running away from God to save his people Israel. He was not running away from God because he was a coward. He was not running away from God because he wanted to be disobedient. He just got blinded by his love for Israel. He loved Israel so much that they thought of him going to Assyria, helping them get their act together, and then them coming and destroying his country. He just couldn't go there. And he's like, no, I can't do that. And so he left. Of course, we know that he did go to Nineveh. He did preach to Nineveh. They did get their act together. They did go and destroy his country. So it's not that Jonah was even wrong. He was just blinded, though, in that moment. He was blinded towards what should have been obedience to God. And that's an interesting mini lesson, because that's something that happens to great men and women of God. I mean, here's the Apostle Paul. He's got personal revelation not to go to Jerusalem. He's got prophets and prophetesses telling him not to go to Jerusalem. He's got Agabus who shows up and ties him up and ties himself up and says, this is what's going to happen to you if you go to Jerusalem. And what does Paul say? What do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? Of course I have to go to Jerusalem. And he did. And what happened? He spent 3 years in jail in Caesarea, and then 3 more years in jail or 2 years in Caesarea, and 3 years in jail between a trip to Rome and in jail in Rome. Just 5 years out of his life. The guy's a prisoner of Rome, because he went to Jerusalem, which he shouldn't have done. But why did he go to Jerusalem? Because he was blinded by his love for Israel. That's exactly what happened to Jonah. So Jonah knew that this was not an offense that would keep him from being in the resurrection of the just. And so here's Jonah, and he's in the water, and you've got to put yourself where he was. It's like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. Yeah, we're going to throw you in the fire, and you're going to walk around in there, and you're going to be fine. Oh, yeah, right. Like that's happened before. And yet that's what happened to them. And here's Jonah. He's thrown off the boat in the middle of the ocean. Is he really honestly going to believe, well, there's this fish that's going to eat me and then I'm going to die and then God's going to raise me from the dead and I'm going to be obedient? No, he thinks he's going to die. He says, I've been banished from your sight. But then he says, but you know what? I've got a hope. I've got a hope. I'm going to look again toward your holy temple. I'm going to be in the resurrection of the just. And that is precisely, and you and I can go there. You know, our brother and sister Christians, that many of them are being martyred for their faith in Christ. You know, in the Middle East and Egypt and other places, you know, there are Christians in Africa that are being martyred for their faith in Christ. And, you know, they've got a hope that, wow, you know, what a wonderful hope we have. You know, and here's Jonah. Even though I've been banished from your sight now, I will look again toward your holy temple. And that's one of the things that we can make sure in our life. Make sure that you're clear on the hope, what's coming, what's going to happen, so you can be excited about it and have that burning hope. And it sure sustained Jonah in this time. Wow. I've been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. And verse 5, the waters surrounded me to the point of death. The deep was around me. The weeds were wrapped around my head. And that kind of obviously happened. Verse 6, I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. And that, again, he wouldn't have known that from inside the fish, but he would know that after he came to himself and said, wow, what just happened? Wow, I was eaten by a fish. That was a few days ago. He would come to himself. And I like verse 6 where it says in the middle, the earth with its bars was around me forever. In other words, he didn't have a hope that God would raise him from the dead. He thought he was going to die and be dead until the resurrection. And the earth here is portrayed as like a dungeon. The earth with its bars, you know, the bars of the dungeon close and lock, and that's the end of it. And so the earth here is kind of seen like a dungeon. You know, the gates of the grave, if you will, translated the gates of Hades in the New Testament, sometimes translated the gates of hell in our English version, but the gates with the bars that closed it. And that's what Jonah was thinking here. He says, the earth with its bars was around me forever, meaning, you know, I was going to be dead until the resurrection. And he says, then you brought up my life from the pit. And the pit is a very common Old Testament, not only in the Old Testament, but in some of the ancient Middle Eastern literature as well. The pit was a figure for the grave, for death. So he says, you know, well, I went down to the bottom of the mountains. You know, I thought I was going to be dead until the resurrection. You know, the dungeon bars were closed. And then what happened? Poof. You brought up my life from the pit, oh Yahweh, my God. And what a great hope. You brought up my life from death. And that's what, you know, we hope for. You know, if the Lord tarries and I pass away, if some of you are about my age, if the Lord tarries and we pass away, what do we hope for? We hope that we're going to get up. Absolutely. God's going to bring up our life. Verse 7, when my life was ebbing away, you know, in those closing seconds, or maybe even minutes in the ocean, and then a minute or so in the fish, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered Yahweh. My prayer came into you, into your holy temple, even though it is in Jerusalem. My prayer came into you, into your holy temple, and you heard me. And then he says, verse 8, those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy. You know, you and I believe in the living God. We believe in Yahweh, and he's the living God. And he'll genuinely help. But then there are idols, and you know, there are idols out there and they don't help. And you know, it's interesting because it was a challenge to translate this, those who regard worthless idols, because the word worthless is a Hebrew word that can mean worthless or lying. It has two different meanings. You look it up in the lexicon. Meaning number one, meaning number two. It can be worthless, it can be lying. So for example, if you're reading a King James Version, it says lying vanities, because the word for idols, it was a sarcastic word that God used for idols that meant nothings. So you could literally translate this, those who regard lying nothings. that's really what idols are. They're worthless, they lie, they promise things that they can't deliver. And it says, if you regard those, if you put your trust in worthless nothings and lying nothings, then what happens? You forsake your own mercy. See, the true God is so willing to help. The true God shows up and helps people. The true God showed up and helped Jonah. You know, but would a lying nothing be able to do that? No, it wouldn't. And so it's an interesting thing that here in this very short, like 8 verse recount of Jonah's kind of experience, he throws in and he just goes, boy, you know, I prayed to Yahweh and he helped me. If I had paid attention to lying nothings, if I had idol gods, then I would just be dead right now. You know, and that's another reason why it's so important we pay attention to those prophecies like tonight, where we're the lights of the world, we're the ones that shine. We can bring the hope of Jesus Christ and everlasting life to people. And people that regard, you know, lying nothings, they do forsake their own mercy, and we have a part to play in helping people not do that, not make that mistake. And verse 9, you know, in contrast to those who regard the lying nothings, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. And I like that, that Jonah doesn't, you can just see Jonah's heart here. He doesn't regard bringing a sacrifice as a burden. You know, some people are like, oh boy, I've got to kill another sheep. I was really hoping to have lamb dinner. Now I got to give this, there's no hint of that. He says, I am going to be so loud in my thanksgiving when I offer my sacrifice to you. That's the way we should feel when we have things to give to God, when we have things to give to God's people. We're either donating money to good causes, or we're giving material good, or we're giving our time, and we're doing that for God, and we're doing it with a voice of thanksgiving. We're so excited to give things to God. And that's what Jonah is saying here. I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. I will pay what I have vowed. And I'm sure as he was in the ocean and just in the first seconds of being in the fish's belly, he was like, okay, God, if some way I will serve you again. And then he says, salvation belongs to Yahweh. And that is precisely correct. Deliverance, both here temporarily and everlasting deliverance, everlasting salvation belongs to Yahweh. And it says, and Yahweh spoke to the fish, and it vomited out Jonah on the dry land. And that's exactly what happened. He vomited Jonah on the dry land, and then God would raise him from the dead. And we'll read the first verse of chapter 3, or actually the first 2. Then the word of Yahweh came to Jonah the second time, saying, get up, go to Nineveh. So here's our phrase, get up again. This time Jonah is going to get up and go to Nineveh. And I will get up and finish this teaching next Tuesday, because you guys have been wonderful to be with me for this long. But this is just such an awesome record. And I hope I've communicated this well about how many cool lessons to you and I today are packed into this little 4-chapter book. It's just such an amazing piece of work. And we'll finish it next Tuesday. So God bless you. Let's open the floor for discussion and all kinds of nifty whatever's going on.